Hi everyone, this is our first video for Chapter 4, and today we're going to be talking about solving and graphing inequalities. So the first thing you need to know, and this is probably familiar to a lot of you, is an inequality is a statement that two quantities are not equal. So up until this point, we've been focused on equations where we're setting two things equal. When we're talking about inequalities, we're talking about two things that are not equal, and we're going to be comparing them. So for example, I know that 1 is not equal to 3. When I'm comparing them using inequalities, what we're going to talk about is 1 is less than 3. So let's talk about all the symbols involved with inequalities. So the first symbol is our symbol that means is less than. And the way I like to remember that is to think this kind of looks like an L. So if you think that's less than. So an example could be x is less than 2. Now, you saw in the Desmos activity today, we know that means we're including all the numbers that are less than 2. So any points along this in here are going to be less than 2. Now, because we cannot include 2, 2 is not less than itself, we're going to put an open circle on 2, and then we're going to shade everywhere here to the left, because those are all the points that are less than 2. So I'm going to make a note here. When we're graphing less than, we use an open circle because we can't include the number itself. Okay, the next symbol now we have is less than or equal to. And that's going to look like this. An example might be x then is less than or equal to 2. Now, since we're saying that x can be 2, it's less than or equal to, we're including 2 when we graph, so we're going to have a closed circle. And we're still going to shade everywhere to the left here, because that's where numbers are less than 2. So let's make a note here. We have a closed circle. All right, our next symbol looks like this, and we read it is greater than. So my example could be x is greater than 2. Now, if I'm looking at a number line, I know all the numbers to the right here are where x is greater than 2. Since we're not including 2, again, we're going to have an open circle at 2, and now we're going to shade to the right. And so I'm going to again make a note that this is an open circle. And then the last symbol we have looks like that, and we would read that is greater than or equal to. So I could write x is greater than or equal to 2. Now, since I can include 2, I'm going to fill in a closed circle, and I'm going to shade to the right because that's where all my numbers are bigger than 2. Now, something that I want to point out that may help some of you remember how to graph. If you have the variable first, that inequality symbol is telling you which way to shade. So for example, x less than 2, that symbol looks like an arrow pointing to the left, and you'll notice that we shaded to the left. If I look at greater than, that looks like an arrow pointing to the right, and we shaded to the right. But remember, in order to use that trick, the variable has to be first in our inequality, and we'll address that in a little more detail coming up here. All right, so a couple problems that we need to be able to do. One is to be able to graph an inequality if we're given one. So we'll just do number 1 for right now. My inequality is x is greater than negative 2. Now, since I'm strictly greater than, I know I'm going to have an open circle on negative 2. And since I know that numbers to the right of negative 2 are going to be greater than negative 2, I'm going to shade to the right. Now we could have also used our trick since the variable is first. Our symbol is showing us to shade to the right, and that's what we did. Now, on the other hand, we might be given a graph and asked to write the inequality. So that's what's going on in number 3. So now, I know I'm going to have my variable, and I know my important point here, or value, is 8. So now I look at where I'm shaded. Since I'm shading to the left, I know those are all the numbers that are less than 8. So I'm going to put in my less than symbol, and that's my inequality. All right, so that's the basics on graphing inequalities. So we're going to flip over now, and we're going to talk about how we solve inequalities. Now, the good news here is that solving inequalities is very, very similar to solving equations. Okay, it's actually the exact same thing as solving equations, except for one really important point here. When solving an inequality, if you ever multiply or divide, if you ever multiply or divide by a negative number, you must flip the inequality symbol. Okay, so I'll give you a second to get that down. So when solving an inequality, if you ever multiply or divide by a negative number, you must flip the inequality symbol. This is going to be super important, and again, this is the only thing that makes solving inequalities different from solving equations. All right, we already talked about the open circle or closed circle. Remember, open circle is when it looks like this, and that's when we have a strictly greater than or a strictly less than. Closed circle comes into play when we're graphing. We're actually going to fill it in. That's if I'm greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. All right, so let's go ahead and try an example. So my example says to solve and graph this inequality. Now, again, our steps are going to look really familiar from when we were solving equations. So I still draw my line. Instead of drawing it through the equal sign, I'm drawing it through the inequality symbol. And so I notice in this example I have variables on both sides. So my job first is get all my variables to one side. And I like to move them to the left. So I'm going to move this x over by subtracting from both sides. Oops, sorry, hold on, the lights went off in the office. Let me get them back on. Okay, there we go. So we're subtracting x from both sides. So now I have 5 here. Now I have negative 3 minus 1, which is going to give me a minus 4x. Over here, my x is canceled, and I just have 13. Now, at this point, I haven't multiplied or divided by a negative, so my symbol stays the same. Now, I want to get my x all by itself, so the next thing I'm going to do is subtract 5 from both sides. I have negative 4x. On this side, 13 minus 5 is 8. Again, I haven't multiplied or divided by a negative, so my symbol's the same. Now, to get x all by itself, I'm going to divide by a negative 4 on both sides. And here now is where I need to realize that since I've divided by that negative number, now the negative 4's are going to cancel. I have x, but instead of having less than or equal to, I'm going to have to flip that to a greater than or equal to, and 8 divided by negative 4 is going to give me a negative 2. So that's what we mean about flipping that inequality symbol. It was less than or equal to, but once I divided by that negative number, I had to flip it and change it to greater than or equal to. So now we're going to go ahead and graph this inequality. I know my key point is at -2. I have greater than or equal to, so that's going to be a closed circle. And now my arrow is showing me to shade to the right. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and shade to the right. And I'm going to put an arrow to show that that would go on forever. Now, here's a note, and it's going to come up. Well, actually, I'll show you an example of what we mean here. In your final answer, make sure your inequality is written with the variable first. And here's what I mean by that. You may solve and you may get an answer that looks like, let's see, -3 is less than x. Now, a lot of people, that's going to give them trouble when they go to graph it. So we recommend you rewrite that with the variable first. So what we're going to do is I want to have x, and I know I'm comparing it to -3. Now, since the big end was opening towards the x, when I rewrite this, the big end still has to be opening towards the x. So these two inequalities are the same thing. They're just rewritten so that x is first. And again, we said when x is first, you can use our trick of using that arrow trick to help you graph. So we're going to want to make sure if your variable isn't first when you solve, we're going to just rewrite it so that it is. So let's look at where this might come up. And we're not going to do all these examples in the video. We'll just do maybe 2 or 3 more. So let's go ahead and look at number 2. So the first thing I have to do before I can graph this is solve it. So I'm going to draw my line. Now in this case, I only have a variable on one side. So the only thing I need to do to get m by itself is I'm going to add 1/2 to both sides. So I add that. Now I have m by itself. I added, so I'm not going to change my symbol. And I have -1 plus 1/2. If you put that in your calculator, should give you a -1/2. Now here's what we meant. My variable is not first in my inequality, so I want to go ahead and rewrite this so that it is. So I'm comparing m, and I know I was comparing that to -1/2. Now again, my inequality opened up, the wide end was pointing at the m. When I rewrite it, that still has to be true. So now I can graph. I'm going to have to estimate here. -1/2 would be halfway between 0 and -1. I have a greater than or equal to, so that's going to be a closed circle right about there. And now if I look, my variable's first, so my arrow is telling me to shade to the right, and so that's what we're going to do here. And again, always putting that arrow on the end to show that that would go on forever. Let's see, let's maybe just do one more. I think then you'll have the idea and we'll have some that we can go over at the start of class. So let's go ahead and pick, let's do number 4. All right, so I'm going to rewrite this so I have a little more room. So x divided by -3 is greater than 2. So I'm going to draw my line. Now, here I was dividing by a -3. I know the inverse of division, or the opposite, is multiplying. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to multiply by -3 on both sides. So now these are going to cancel and I'll have just x. But now since I said multiply by a negative, now I need to flip the inequality symbol. And 2 times -3 is -6. So I just want to make a note here that we had to flip the symbol because we multiplied by -3. All right, so now this one works out. My x is already on the left side, so my arrow is telling me to shade to the left. I'm at -6, and since I'm just less than, I'm going to have an open circle, and I'm going to shade to the left. All right, I think that's enough to get us started. When we're back in class after the break, we'll go through a couple examples to get us warmed up, and then you'll have an activity to practice this. All right, I hope you have a wonderful break, and I'll see you when we're back.